Thank you. So tonight I have going to tell you a very long poem, and we will translate it on the back wall. So if you can't see over here, you'll have to come around a little bit. Okay? And so, because it was spring, and because I had avoided it for so long, I set off, lowering myself down into a hole, and then out onto the wide plain, a sky full of autumn, and everything shaking in long blue shadows. I carry a photograph of a city. A car comes driving out of a film, headlights blinking, and goes right past. Hello. Excuse me. Can you tell me where I am? And I was in the middle of this long conversation with a friend, and she said, "Who taught you what beauty is?" And I didn't know what to say. And what is beauty anyway? Something enormous and deep or complicated beyond reason? And the question kept going beyond me, becoming more and more removed, like off Broadway. Or sex that's so X-rated that it's X-rated. But Tom Waits calls people who are so incredibly naked that they actually have no skin. Or maybe the answer is that life itself is just bad art. I mean, it has no real plot, and the themes are random and jumbled. And there's one story going on, and then it's dropped, and then characters reappear, and then they die for no reason and in no particular dramatic order. And you have so many of your own voices telling you what to do and what to think and where to go. It's like there are just too many writers, and they're working all night, traveling around like the empty buses that circle around the city at night with no passengers. Sort of like they're on automatic. And then, at the bottom of the heap, there's your subconscious, and it's always trying to communicate. But the problem is, it can't use words. It doesn't know any words. And so, it shows you things. See this blue? What does this remind you of? And you can spend years trying to figure this kind of thing out. And then, there are the holes in language. And here's one. And I'll just hide here for a few minutes before we go on. Wait, I said. Wait for me. Until summer, anyway. Just wait for me. But you didn't. You didn't wait. it started out with a bad day. And I was sitting around in my studio, feeling sorry for myself. And the phone rang, and a voice said, "This is so-and-so, and I'm from NASA, and we'd like you to be the first artist in residence here." And I said, "You're not from NASA." And I hung up the phone. About 5 minutes later, the same person called, and I said, "Come on, I was sure that it was a fan who had figured out what my secret dream was, and had decided to torture me." Finally, I called someone at NASA, and he said that yes, I'd actually been chosen to be the first artist in residence for NASA, and he wanted to see if I was interested. And I said, "Well, what does an artist in residence actually do? What does that mean with a space program?" And they said they didn't really know what that meant, and what did I think it meant? And I thought, who are these people? Anyway, I took the job, and for 2 years, I worked as a government agent in the space program. And I went to a lot of the NASA centers, Hubble and Ames, and the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, and Mission Control in Houston. And I looked at all sorts of projects and research on nanotechnology and robotics, and various models of time, and space telescopes, and superstrings, and giant visionary, almost like art projects, like building a stairway to space. Now, my official post was as NASA's first artist in residence, and I was so proud. I thought, you almost never get to be first at anything. And I took it really seriously, like trying to figure out various ways for artists and scientists to do things together. Now, recently, I got a letter asking me to submit my final report to sum up my experiences at the agency. And this was really daunting. What kind of report could it possibly be? Should I start with science or beauty? Or should it be about the similarities of science and art? Or maybe the differences? Or the science of art? Or the art of science? And I was in the middle of the first draft of my report when I got another call from the agency, and they informed me that I'm not just the first artist in residence at NASA, I'm also the last. And so I revised my report pretty substantially, and this is it. Starting is always the hard part. It's like stuttering. You're only afraid at the beginning. That's where the fear is. So you only stutter at the beginning of the word, when it's starting. Nobody ever stutters at the end. There's no stuttering. Because by then, it's too late to be afraid. By then, there are only the regrets. Now the job started with an accident. February 2nd, 2003. The shuttle Columbia blew up, and the pieces came shrieking down at hundreds of miles an hour, bouncing onto lawns, plunging into swimming pools, shattering along highways. A 700-pound rocket engine drilled down into the moss in the middle of the forest, and the trail of parts stretched from California to Florida. Thieves on horseback roamed around the wreckage, posing as NASA scientists, picking up circuit boards and tiles and bits of twisted metal. And I thought, it's happening again. Our technology's just blowing apart, and it's falling back down on top of us. And then they began putting the pieces together in a big warehouse and arranging the tiny fragments into the shape of the shuttle. And there was so much space between the pieces. Mostly, it was a map of missing things. And I thought, you know, when you look at something this big and this broken, where do you begin? Now, one of the first places I went was Baltimore, because the Hubble Space Telescope is there. And one of the most beautiful images I've ever seen was on the front page of the New York Times. And it was pictures of these huge towers of cumulus clouds with bright spikes of light jutting out. And what looked like the sky was pink and this kind of pale baby blue. And the caption below was, "Stars being born in outer space." And I couldn't believe it. It was all so classic, like straight ahead Disney. And so I spent some time at the Hubble headquarters, and I got to talk to the people who were interpreting the data from the telescope, and then making the images out of these numbers. And I said, now, are these the actual colors out here? I mean, does it really look this pink and this blue? And they said, well, every picture is a kind of interpretation in some ways, of course. And I said, but could you have used a whole different color range? Interpreted that baby blue as gray, and maybe that pink is like a brownish purple. I mean, how did you decide on these colors? And they said, well, we thought people would like them. And I said, you thought people would like them? And I'm the one they call the artist in residence here? I mean, don't you know this could really fool people? I mean, they might get the wrong idea about what's going on out there. I mean, that looks so perfect. That looks like a Tiepolo painting. I mean, that looks like a painting of heaven. Then again, we're always fixing up photographs. You know, like that miserable Christmas. Everybody's standing around the tree all pale and angry and exhausted. A little tweaking with Photoshop, and suddenly, looks like everybody had a really great holiday. A really memorable one. But you know, one of the things that really bothers me about photography is that you never know how hot it is in a photograph. You look at people in photographs, and it's hard to tell whether they're hot or they're cold. I mean, temperature, the feeling of the air, smells. Those are things that pictures just can't seem to do. And there's so many things that we just have no idea how to capture or how to record. And then there are the stars. the bonfires of the universe. And there's so many different colors, red and yellow and green and brilliant whites. And then the brown dwarfs and the hot blue giants. And the cool dim red ones, so dim you can hardly see them. And the ancient bundles of stars, 10 billion years old, packed so tightly they look like endless, unfocused lights. But the thing I hadn't realized was that stars aren't there in a random way. There's a secret order in the sky, and the colors of the stars tell you their age, their origin, how they began. And I'd never realized this before. I'd never realized that I was living in an enormous clock. Can't play in that key. So, we'll take a little pause while we find the sound, and we'll begin like a little intermission. Okay. I have to say that I've started to really hate symmetry. I mean, it's so simple-minded. They're just visual rhymes. And so there's one thing over here, and there was a very similar thing over there. And so they balance, they rhyme. And that's supposed to make it good somehow, beautiful. And then there are the things that are tipped way off balance. There's a big thing over here and just a dot over there. This sort of Zen approach to scale. Although I have to say I find that kind of perfection really sort of claustrophobic. And then there's the haiku. Practically the shortest poetic form ever invented, clocking in at just 17 syllables. And haikus aren't about a single thing at all. They're just about one thing, one time, one place, a tree, a rock, the weather, the air. But my favorite haiku goes like this. Spring thaw, a coughing fit overwhelms the puppeteer. I mean, that's amazing. You know, perfect. You're suddenly right there with the coughing fit and the puppeteer, you know, like the whole thing. Now, by the way, a while ago, I had this idea to do an opera based on the novel Gravity's Rainbow. And so I wrote to Thomas Pynchon, the author of the book, and I made this proposal, and I could see Slothrop and all the characters caught up in these chords and notes and music. And I described how it all might work, and I didn't think I'd ever hear from him, since he's such a famous recluse. But actually, he did finally write back, and he said he would be so glad and honored to have an opera made by me and based on Gravity's Rainbow, and that he had only one condition, and that was that the entire opera would be scored for a single instrument, and that instrument would be the banjo. Now, can you imagine a whole opera, 2 or 3 acts of solid wall-to-wall solo banjo, the overture, the arias, the choruses, the whole thing, you know? And now some people have the nicest way of saying, no, 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 not over my dead body. And then, last summer, I was on tour in Italy with my band, and we were playing in theaters that were outside, and it was really beautiful. These long, hot summer nights, and all these people with their huge black eyes. And one evening, we were playing the concert on top of a hill, and I was singing, and in the middle of the song, I heard this brand new part. And I thought, wow, Peter is such a great musician. He's always inventing these cool new parts. But then I looked over at his hands, and his hands were doing something completely different. They didn't match the rhythm at all. And finally, the song was winding down, and there were only a few notes left. But this beautiful little melody was still going on. And I realized it was coming from a tree next to the stage, just beyond where they'd hung all these colored lights. And it was an owl, a tiny owl. And we were singing a duet. And I thought, you know, I can die right now, because life does not get better than this. And we sang a little longer, and there was a whole audience of humans out there in the dark, sitting and listening to this strange duet. And then everything started moving backwards, and I smelled a certain something. And you know, the day you realize that you'll never tell your real story, your own story, that's the day your life begins. Good evening. Table for 5,000, please. You know, last fall, I spent some time at the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena with the engineers who were working on the robot rover Spirit and Opportunity. And they were taking them out into the desert and driving them around. But now that they're up on Mars, they're completely on their own. But these aren't really so much remote-controlled robots. They're more like mechanisms that are doing a lot of lifelike things. So, for example, they can make decisions, and they can even sort of improvise, almost like a human geologist would. Now, one of the things they do a lot of is rock analysis. And so they find the rock they want to look at, and then they find a big flat rock, and they put the target rock on this kind of table rock, and then they have a kind of crusher arm. And this crusher arm comes down and crushes the rock. But when I was there, they were having a lot of problems with this crusher arm. It kept coming down and just missing the rock just by like a couple of millimeters. And they said that this was a problem that often comes up when you're working with mechanisms that have a kind of primitive awareness. And it's a kind of a spatialization problem. So that there's a discrepancy between where the robot rover is and where the robot rover thinks it is. A problem a lot of humans have as well. Where you are and where you think you are, they're really almost never in the same place. I also spent some time at Ames, where they're doing a lot of work with nanotechnology and new materials like for spacesuits. And these materials have changed a lot since the beginning. In the 60s, the suits were made of these really kind of flimsy material, almost like tinfoil. And then, in the 80s, they were more like medieval armor or exoskeletons, lots of pads and joints. And now, the suits are back to being very flexible, but with lots of new biological features built in. So, for example, there's one feature that increases the strength of your arm 40 times. And another that will automatically put a splint in your arm when the increase your strength 40 times feature malfunctions and you're on your own and in the suit. And these suits are also lined with layers of liquids and a series of entry points so that you can automatically be injected with steroids or amphetamine, or if you're hurt, with morphine. And I said, this is like a really amazing suit. And they said, well, actually, NASA isn't going to be working on the contract for this suit. The contract has been transferred to a new joint team. And that new joint team is MIT and the US Army. And so these suits aren't going to be going into outer space after all. Instead, they'll be going out into the desert, out into the war. See The Fog of War, the film with Robert McNamara. And in the film, he's sitting there talking about the old days when he was Secretary of Defense in the Kennedy administration. And he mentions, sort of in passing, well, yeah, actually, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were planning to explode nuclear weapons on the dark side of the moon. And I thought, wait a second. Don't we get to vote on something like that? I mean, can things like that just happen without anybody knowing about them? My worst fear is that someday I'll look up at the moon and there will be a strategic air command center there and you won't really be able to see it without a big telescope. But but you'll know it's there. Then again, the moon has always been such a haunted place. You know, to make art, we say today, it helps to have an audience. But what kind, I said, burning my fingers on the hot toast. Well, it starts out in your living room and you do puppet shows for your parents and their friends. And then later you're playing in bars and clubs, and then later theaters, and maybe later at some big opera house, and then it's back to the bars and the clubs, and then finally, you know, you're back in your own living room performing for, you know, the neighbors' kids. Now recently, I was in Turkey on tour, and I was watching TV, and it was a music show, and an orchestra was playing, but they didn't cut away between pieces. They kept the cameras rolling while the orchestra was tuning up for the next piece. But because this wasn't always the most interesting shot, they turned the cameras around, they began to shoot the audience. And what was amazing was that everybody in the audience had Uzis and AK-47s. And they're standing around with these giant guns, pointing them in various directions every time they turned. And that's just what they did in this particular Turkish city. Now, obviously, for performers, this is like their worst nightmare. A heavily armed audience, and then a lull in the action when anything might happen. Keep it moving, we say in America, where it's really more about the audience and what they want and when they want it. And what they want is mostly more shows, more of the real stuff of life. People just exactly like them, only more so. Life, the way it should be, could be, sometime, somewhere. But we do have such a cold touch, fixing things even if they were working before we started to fix them. And at the beginning of the war with Iraq, everybody was so baffled. We kept saying, but, why does everybody hate us? And we actually think this about ourselves, that we are people who care about the world, who run into burning buildings to save people. And we explain this to ourselves over and over, why they hate us. They hate us because we're rich and democratic and free. That's why they hate us. But you know, it's like in high school, when the beautiful girl says, people hate me because I'm beautiful. No, people hate you because you're a jerk. Then again, what does beauty have to do with it? As in America the Beautiful, a country where every road leads to a foe. And along the way there's Chuck E. Cheese and a million different snacks, and you're never going to go hungry. And just because you're so sick of loud alarms and orange and red alerts, doesn't mean we know for 1 second how they really work and what they do. Hey, look up there. It's our supersized flag. And tell me how you'll know when this war is over. Because this war will never be over. It will just keep moving from place to place. I live in downtown Manhattan, right next to the West Side Highway, right in a police checkpoint. And there are constant sirens and blockades. And during orange alerts, motorcades of police cars go screaming up the highway as they train for maneuvers. And across the street, hidden at the end of the pier, there's the FBI headquarters. So lately, I've tried to get out of town as much as possible. So I've been going on these 10-day walks. Now last spring, I decided to go to the mountains, and the idea was to take a trip with my dog, Lola Bell, and spend some time with her and do a kind of experiment to see if I could learn to talk with her. Now I'd heard that rat terriers could understand about 500 words, and I wanted to see which ones they were. Now terriers are working dogs, and they're all about security. And they're bred to protect borders. And so they do these constant perimeter checks, looking for any suspicious holes or breaks in the wall or little irregularities. So Lola Bell does her rounds around my house every day. And she also does a bit of herding, so when new people come into a room, she taps them on the knee with your nose to take a running count. And then she trains her eye on the door, keeping track of the motion in and out of the room. But if someone leaves the room, she can't subtract. Let's see, 10 10 minus 1 would be... And so she has to start counting all over again from the top. And so this is like a really time-consuming job. Now I took Lolabelle to California, up into the northern mountains, to a little isolated cabin near Zen monastery. And they brought food up from the monastery every few days, but we never actually saw anyone. The bread and the vegetables and the supplies just appeared once in a while out near the gate. And so it was an ideal situation for an experiment like this one. Now it was February, and the mountains were covered with these tiny wildflowers. And every day was so beautiful that we just got up and went out, and it was so dazzling and peaceful. Such a huge, tall sky, and very thin, pale blue air, and hawks circling. So every morning we just headed out and started walking, and what happened was more or less beauty got in the way of the experiment. It was just so beautiful up there that I just really forgot about the whole project, really. It just slipped my mind. And most days, we walked down to the ocean, which took several hours, and we almost never saw anyone on the trails. And Lolabelle would trot in front of me on the path, checking it out, doing a little advance work, a little surveillance. And for fun sometimes, she would drop back and hide behind a rock. And I would turn around and come running back up the path, calling her name. And then she'd jump up from behind the rock, laughing her head off. And then we just keep on going, just sort of goofing around and checking out plants and lying down and having snacks of carrots. Now occasionally, out of the corner of my eye, I'd see some turkey vultures circling in this very lazy way up in the sky. And I didn't think much about it. And then one morning, suddenly, there they were, swooping down right in front of me, and I could smell them before I could see them. This wild and super funky draft of air, like somebody's really, really bad breath. And I turned around and they were dropping down through the air, lowering themselves straight down vertically like helicopters, with their claws wide open, right on top of Lolabelle. And it seemed impossible that they could hover like that. And then I realized that they were hovering because they were in the middle of changing their plan. This little white thing that looked like a tiny white bunny from 2,000 feet up was turning out to be just a little too big to grab by the neck. And they were hanging there for a moment, weighing it, calculating, figuring it out. And then I saw Lolabelle's face. And she had one of these brand new expressions. First was the realization that she was prey, and that these birds had come to kill her. And second was a whole new thought. It was the realization that they can come from the air. I mean, I never thought of that. A whole 180 more degrees that I'm now responsible for. It's not just the stuff down here, the paths and the roots and the trees, but all of this, too. And the rest of the time we were in the mountains, out on the trails. She just kept looking over her shoulder and trotting along with her head in the air. And she had a whole new gait, really awkward, not with her nose to the ground following the smells, but pointing straight up, sniffing, sampling, scanning the thin sky. Like there's something wrong with the air. And I thought, where have I seen this look before? And then I realized it was the same look on the faces of my neighbors in New York in the days right after 9/11, when they suddenly realized, first, that they could come from the air, and second, that it would be that way from now on. It would always be that way. And we had passed through a door, and we would never be going back. The dogs are doing such a good job tonight. Era un buco tanto grande, proprio in mezzo alla città. E così hanno chiamato gli architetti. Che ne pensate di una collina di fagioli? Dice uno. No, perché non qualcosa di molto alto. Costruiamo un numero molto grande ed un'altezza tremenda che confonde i sensi. Forse addirittura potrebbe rappresentare la gente. E una fetta di formaggio, dice l'altro, qualcosa di puro, di organico, qualcosa che può piacere a tutti. Sì, una fetta di formaggio o una ciambella, qualcosa che ricordi tempi migliori. L'importante è che non sembri abbandonato o colpito da radiazioni. Un'altra grande piazza nobile e vuota per ricordarci come siamo insignificanti. Che ne dite di una balestra decorata? Può andare da qui a Marte, può essere fatta di lacrime e inchiostro versato. Era lì. L'idea era appesa a un filo, come un uomo linciato, reggendo qualcosa di troppo, davvero troppo pesante. E così di colpo si apre una porta e noi entriamo in un altro tempo, cuore, o sorriso. Mostrami un fotogramma per volto, ho detto. Torna indietro e passa un fotogramma per volto. Ma sapete, è tanta la gente a cui devo qualcosa. Quell'uomo al college aveva pochi capelli e sapevano di accoraggia. E perché io, che in realtà ero lì per pitturare, perché ho deciso di fare sesso con quello schifoso. Dai, rilassati. Archivialo come attività di ricerca. Niente un altro stupido dettaglio poteva vederlo. Me lo diceva con gli occhi. Adesso vieni qui. Dai, ti abbraccio e possiamo stare tristi tutto il pomeriggio. Sbobinami del cuore le croci e i cruci. Fatti una birra, si ricomincia. Non avevo un piano e mi restava poca dinamite. Stronzo, ho gridato. Brutto bastardo. E lui è sparito. Perché davvero era solo un altro scenario, un altro passo verso il peggio. Sinfonia numero 1. Tutte le cose da cui stai scappando. Sinfonia numero 2. Tutte le cose che non c'erano nella sinfonia numero 1. L'ultima sinfonia. Tutte le note suonate a ritroso, come l'ultima storia d'amore, quella che avvolge e contiene tutte le altre, perfino una molto goffa, difficile e bellissima. La prima.
Did you know that at least 20 tons of Martian rocks are now on Earth? I mean, how did all that stuff get here? Pieces of Mars that were blown off the planet or tossed up, maybe like volcanoes. And they just kept going, out past their moons, through the voids of space, eventually landing all over the solar system. And can you imagine if that happened to you on Earth? Gravity suspended, everything that isn't nailed down starts to rise up through the rain, up through the clouds, out of sight, 20-ton trucks, huge cranes, whole cages from the zoo. Anyway, these Martian rocks and meteorites have been found in several places. Morocco and Russia, and there are lots of them down in Antarctica too, strewn all over the place in the snow. But now that we know that penguins are gay, it's like a whole different story down there in Antarctica. Lots of brand new nature stories. And you know that gay penguins find partners, and they're partners for years. And they're very faithful. And some of them get really desperate for eggs. And if they can't find eggs, then they use rocks. And they sit on the rocks for the exact right number of days, 34 days. And then, of course, comes day 35, day 36, day 37. Nothing is happening at all, and it's gradually dawning on them that they might as well be sitting on meteorites for all they know. And the last 37 days have been a total waste of their time. But you know, the moons of Mars, the tiny moons, are named Phobos and Deimos, Greek for fear and panic. Now, can you imagine naming your moons Fear and Panic? I mean, those are names for someone else's moons. Our own moon is just, you know, the moon, rising and setting above us, beautiful, white or golden, the subject of a million love songs. And it's not a twin or a double. It's our only one, our only moon. We don't have a spare. You know, my biggest regret about the residency at NASA was that I didn't get to go up in the Vomit Comet, the plane where astronauts train for work in zero-G. Do you know, walking on the moon would be so amazing. And also, such a great place for all the new dance companies. And think of all the new sports that could be developed there. Sports that didn't depend on things like waiting for the ball to drop. Then again, there's no such thing as falling, really, because gravity is an illusion, a trick of the eye, not a force. And it's caused by the geometry of space-time. So objects, when they fall, aren't being pulled straight down. They're sailing along the space-time curve. They're traveling along these lines that only look like down. You know, when I was in Houston, I looked at a lot of old photographs of astronauts. And there they were, spinning around in space, turning around and around, connected to the capsule by just the thinnest of cables. And sometimes they'd float right past the window. Hello. Excuse me.